Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Today marks the anniversary of the founding of the first California mission by St. Junipero Serra. This was in 1769. That anniversary warrants all of us to pay attention. There's been a tremendous amount of modern, fashionable historical outrage today, and the modern campaign is to paint Junipero Serra as someone whom scholarship simply doesn't prove him to be. If we're genuine about our historical inquiry, then we will actually paint this Franciscan missionary in the saintly brush that he deserves. Every generation, as we get further and further from an historical event, has the responsibility of distinguishing history from twisted revisionist history. A civilization that is not careful will wind up rewriting its past, and every time it does that, it will lose confidence in its future. California has become one of the greatest examples of this phenomenon. It has shown relentless effort in transforming, in this case, one of its greatest saints into one of its greatest villains, despite an overwhelming body of evidence that points in the opposite direction. It would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic. My bride and I lived in California shortly before the racial revolts and riots of 2020, and only a short distance from our home stood a statue of St. Junipero Serra. The riots took place, a lot of the riots took place near where we lived. And when I say near, I mean nary one street away. And this particular statue was targeted. And it eventually became another casualty of revolutionary idiocy because the activists targeted it and destroyed it. They found that much easier to do because it was demonstrative virtue signaling, and it was outrage, but the opposite would have involved a careful reading of primary sources. This man spent his life defending Indigenous people, and now he's the public symbol of everything supposedly evil about Western civilization. Give me a break. This inversion of history would be, again, almost humorous if its consequences were not so destructive and tragic. Genuine scholarship demands evidence. We are thinking beings. The problem is, progressivist ideological activism frequently only demands emotional explosion, and that's what we've been getting in the hordes. There's a great book by Agnes Replia. It's her biography of Junipero Serra. It's entitled Junipero Serra. And she points out several of the conquistadors under Hernan Cortes did conduct themselves in morally deficient ways. She doesn't paint all of them to be saints, sure, but she demonstrated that Serra and the Franciscan missionaries were an entirely different generation. And they had an entirely different vocation. They were not here to colonize. Their mission centered upon evangelization, drawing people to know Jesus Christ and to discover the true meaning of the human person in light of the incarnation and how we ought to live in relationship with Christ. So it's not about conquest. It was about spiritual formation. Replia shows through historical evidence how Serra, through testimony of his own letters and actions, reformed a virtuous political imagination amongst, in this case, the indigenous people. Unfortunately, the leftist ideologues of today would have a lot to say about this, in contrary, even though they have no evidence. One of the greatest failures of current historical revisionism involves a romantic portrayal of pre-contact California in the United States. Now, this is what I mean. They suggest that the Spanish, when they arrived in California, encountered sophisticated democratic societies that had advanced public institutions equivalent to European civilization, and that they had advanced education, they had advanced research, they had advanced economic infrastructure. Well, the archaeological record, together with anthropological research, actually reveals that all that existed were thousands of small tribe communities that had a lot of diversity, sure, and that diversity led to frequent warfare. It was significantly undereducated, and there was persistent conflict over territory and resources. That was the history of in this case, pre-mission California. Stephen Powers, a historian, documented extensive intertribal warfare throughout California throughout the 19th century. Later anthropologists, people like Robert Heiser, for example, concluded that warfare formed a recurring feature of many of the tribal societies long before Europeans reached the Pacific coast. Those observations don't diminish, they're just historical facts. Every civilization possesses both admirable achievements, but in this case, tremendous tragic failures through every century of human history. So thank God for the Catholic missions. The simplistic story of portraying California Indians exclusively through the modern categories of the innocent, sophisticated victims, and that the Europeans were exclusively ruthless oppressors, it just doesn't hold historical scrutiny. It simply doesn't. It's an ideological caricature. Serra entered California through the spirituality of St. Francis of Assisi. And no, I'm not talking about bird-loving St. Francis of Assisi. I'm talking about the spirituality that not only emphasized a simplistic way of living with humility, but also sacrificial love and a stalwart, intelligent proclamation of the gospel for every human person, because souls possess dignity as bearers of the divine image, and by virtue of that, they had to be educated and therefore given the opportunity to flourish. Because of the redeeming work of Jesus Christ, that St. Francis inspired Junipero Serra. And so what did Serra do? He devoted an extraordinary physical endurance toward walking, for example, thousands of miles across difficult terrain, despite chronic leg pain that he had, because he believed eternal salvation had a greater value than anything else. And so he wrote letters, and all of his surviving letters reveal deep concern for the spiritual welfare of those in his care, together with the physical welfare of the indigenous communities under his pastoral responsibility. This was a spiritual father. And his concern was not only confined to preaching. He challenged military authorities if he saw that they might violate or mistreat the native people. In 1773, he traveled more than 2,000 miles to Mexico City to petition Viceroy Antonio Maria de Bucareli for stronger legal protections. Historians describe that as the representación. We actually have documented evidence of this. And I could go on and on. All of that conduct proves to us that he doesn't befit the caricature of a bloodthirsty colonizer. That's a lie. But the missions did tremendous good for North America and therefore for the indigenous people. Junipero Serra and his cohort taught them agricultural techniques, irrigation, wheat cultivation, vineyard cultivation, trained them to form orchards, animal husbandry, taught them masonry, carpentry, blacksmithing, weaving, ceramics, and equipped many of the indigenous converts with practical skills so that they could make livings for themselves. All of this were, before European contact, simply unheard of to them. Those developments produced lasting consequences. So the indigenous people flourished. They actually created wealth that did not exist before. But then from there, it created an infrastructure that allowed for California to eventually be assumed into what we now know as the United States. And so the Catholic Church eventually canonized Serra because his personal holiness emerged through historical investigation. The church did that careful investigation. Christians, we have another compelling reason for remembering Serra. Christianity consistently generated institutions that elevated human flourishing wherever the gospel was preached. And Christian civilizational inheritance is one of the main reasons we have the gift of the United States today. The Christian contribution to the American experiment is beyond the Franciscan missions, but they are certainly a part of it. And so Junipero Serra deserves remembrance today. His legacy reveals what Christian conviction can accomplish in terms of leading people to salvation in Christ, and by virtue of that, granting them the grace, perseverance, diligence, and skill for flourishing in this life and the propagation of the common good, so that the greater work of the gospel can be made manifest for the salvation of souls. And so, yes, let us remember Junipero Serra proudly and fondly, and by virtue of that, let us share in his missionary zeal to bring about the proclamation of the gospel for eternal salvation and, secondarily, human flourishing. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter.